My name is David Harris. I'm the Managing Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. On behalf of the Institute and Harvard Law School and Harvard University, I'd like to welcome you tonight. We're very pleased to be here for the release of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council's report, The State of Equity in Metro Boston. Before I say any more, I'd like to thank a few members of my staff and the Harvard Law School staff, Kelly Garvin and Ernest Owens, who aren't here but who did a lot of work to make this happen, and Sarah Marston of our communications office. So I want to be brief tonight, but I want to say that we at the Institute are very thankful to be part of this event. Those of you who know me from my past life know that I did a lot of fair housing work. And since coming to the Institute, we haven't been able to do too much. But this project is very important and it's very consistent with what we call community justice. There are two cornerstones of community justice that this project exemplifies. One of which is that we can't silo our work. We can't separate out what we do in one area from what we do in another area. And if we do that, we're going to fail. The other is the recognition that we all are bound together, that our communities are bound together, and we have to refuse to think of them as separate entities. It's the 351 cities and towns of Massachusetts. And I'm reminded in thinking about this of the words of Charles Hamilton Houston, who reminded us as he engaged on his school desegregation work. He said, all of our struggles tie in together. We have to do all of our work in housing, education, healthcare. It all ties in together. I'm also reminded of Martin Luther King's admonition that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So although we at the Institute find the findings of this report sobering, we're heartened that the report, released in the name of 101 cities and towns of the region, all of which belong to MAPC, has focused attention on the critical question of the differential distribution of opportunity across the region, and has taken a step toward creating a set of metrics and measures that we can use to assess our progress toward eliminating those differences. As one who in his previous life was part of the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance and Action for Regional Equity, I'm particularly pleased to see that we find ourselves here to talk about wedding the notion of growth for the region with the notion of equity. For those of us who have been working in this field, this is truly a promising event. I want to add one important disclaimer before I start. I'm sure as we hear the report, there are many of us who might think that there are things that have been left out. There might be indicators that we think would be more appropriate and belong in this report. And, you know, I think we'd all be right. But I want us to focus on the fact, two facts. One, that it's very difficult to get data on all the things that we might want. But secondly, that what we do have and what you will see today represents rigorous, reliable, and replicable data. And that's really important as we move forward and try to think about how we make progress. I'd also say, as one who worked with Action for Regional Equity to pass a data collection bill, that it reminds us that what we need to do if we don't have the data we need is we need to fight to make sure that the data we need to do our work are collected and reported in consistent and reliable ways. I think that jumps a little ahead to certain kind of policy questions that we'll address at a later point. So I'd like to just start the program off now by introducing Mary Skelton Roberts, who will speak to us, a senior program officer for the environment at the Barr Foundation, who has been at the Barr Foundation since 2009, is that right? And where she co-manages the foundation's climate change grant-making program, focusing on land use and transportation as key levers for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Mary?
Thank you, David, for the introduction, and thank you, Mark, and the rest of the MAPC staff for producing this report and convening us here this evening. As David said, I'm Mary Skelton Roberts. I work at the Barr Foundation, which provided funding for the report. It's actually one of the first grants I made when I joined BAR as a program officer. I helped manage the grant making related to climate change, where our goal is to make Boston and Massachusetts national models for emission reductions. And so you might be wondering, what in the world does climate change have to do with equity? As it turns out, quite a lot. But rather than talk about that, let me tell you a story. The offices of the BAR Foundation are on Lewis Wharf in the North End. I started there nearly 3 years ago. When I decided to accept the job, I called my sister, who lives in Maryland, right away to tell her. She was thrilled for me. She was extremely excited. And she fed on the excitement and energy, and like sisters do, we kept talking faster and faster. But then she asked me, "Where's your office?" And when I said the North End, there was a long pause. "It's different now," I said. Why such a strong reaction? Well, in the 1980s, my sister and I went to high school in the North End. And the memories I have are not of freshly baked cannolis at Mike's Pastry, or the al dente pasta at Preza, Assaggio's, which is one of my favorite, or Mama Maria's. My memories of the North End include a short walk from the Orange Line to Christopher Columbus High School that didn't feel short for me or my sister, because we were getting pelted by snowballs by classmates who clearly did not want me and my sister in their neighborhood. I couldn't wait to graduate and get out of Boston. For me, college was not just a pathway to personal fulfillment and success, it was a one-way ticket out of the city. Even at 17 years old, my sister and I knew that this was not a place where we could thrive. I left at 17, she left at 25. But like the rest of the nation, Boston and the North End have changed a lot since the 1980s. For one, I no longer get pelted by snowballs in the neighborhood. And that isn't just because of climate change, or so far, snowless December and November. My alma mater, Christopher Columbus, is no longer a school. It's been converted to a bunch of high-end condos. These days, open displays of racism just don't fly. In fact, our public official and business leaders, our organizational mission and value statements are so full of open displays of commitments to diversity, inclusiveness, and multicultural. Those who do get caught making racist comments in the public square see their careers implode almost instantly. With a black president in the White House, many have taken to argue that we are now in a post-racial society, that all of the ugliness is behind us, that talking about race and class just divides people at a time when we need to come together to address the real issues. But the problem with this story is that it's just a story, and however appealing it may be, it falls apart in the face of the facts. Like the fact featured in this report, in which the Globe reported on Sunday, that a black woman, which is me, with a college education is more likely to have a low birth weight baby than a white woman who didn't finish high school. Or the fact that in Metro Boston, black students drop out of high school at twice the rate of their white and Asian counterparts, Latinos more than 3 times as much, or the many other difficult but important facts Mark will lead us through in a moment. The real story is the state of equity, in the state that all things are not equal. It is the same story that President Obama told at his speech last week in Kansas. He spoke of a time if you gave it your all, you'd take enough home to raise your family, send your kids to school, have your health care covered, and put a little bit away for retirement. And he lamented the sad reality that America is looking less and less like the place it appears to be, where everyone can make it if we try. When you actually look at the data, which Mark is going to go through, we are worse off now than we were 50 years ago. After World War II, a child born in poverty had about a 5 in 10 chance of making it into middle class. But by the 1980s, their chances slipped to 4 in 10. Now it is 3 in 10. These are grim findings and difficult conversations to have. The State of Equity report makes clear that our work is far from over. If Metro Boston and Massachusetts are to remain competitive, we must create the space to advance the dialogue about the inequities that exist here and embrace our new reality. There are significant structural inequalities that limit opportunities for a huge segment of society. We can't accept the argument that a rising tide lifts all boats, because the sad reality is Too many people in Metro Boston and across the country don't even have votes. We saw that in Louisiana. And more often than not, those people are poor, those people are children, those people are elderly, and those people are of color. Only when we face and accept these hard realities can we work to do the hard work of identifying specific policies and interventions to shift the tide, and to make this a place where every person has the opportunity to graduate well-educated, to live where they choose, and to see Massachusetts as a viable place where they can realize their dreams and thrive, and not somewhere they are trying to run away from. This is my hope for my daughter, as she starts kindergarten this year at a school just 2 miles from where school began for me, but worlds apart in terms of the welcome she receives from her classmates and her community. This is my hope for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to the Barr Foundation. As Mary said, I'd like to now introduce Mark Drayson, who will take us through the report. Most of you, I'm sure if not all of you, know Mark, and so it's a kind of redundancy to introduce him, but I will simply say he's the Executive Director of MAPC, position he's held since 2002.
Yeah, I know.
And it's showing. His smile remains, however. Before that, he was the President and CEO of MACDC, the Mass Association of Community Development Corporations, prior to which he was the Executive Director of CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. From 1991 to 95, Mark served as state representative from Boston and Brookline. And before he comes up, I'd like to acknowledge, speaking of, I believe that Representative Wolf is with us, and I'd like to acknowledge her. Thank you very much, Representative, for joining us. Oh, I'm sorry, and also Representative Holmes is here. Where's Representative Holmes? Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you coming out. With no further ado, Mark, it's all yours.
Good evening. Thank you very much, David. I appreciate enormously the Institute and the law school hosting us at this evening's event. What, y'all going to abandon me up here? Is that it? Or, no, that's usually the case. And I want to particularly thank Mary Skelton-Roberts. First of all, because, and the lesser point is that the Barr Foundation funded most of this research and made it possible for us to do the work. The main reason I'd like to thank Mary is for coming back to Boston. Thank you very much. We're very, very lucky to have you. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a PowerPoint exercise. First, I want to acknowledge some of the wonderful folks on my staff who did this work over the last year and a half. Basically, MAPC is an organization of about 60 wonderful, talented people, 59 of them do incredible work, and I get to do PowerPoints. That's sort of the situation, so I want to thank and acknowledge them. The principal authors of this report, who have done the lion's share of the work and the effort and the conceptualization and the implementation, are Mariana Arcaya and Jesse Grogan, and I'd like to ask them to rise. I am really standing on their shoulders this evening. The work was also overseen by Amy Cotter, who is our Director of Regional Plan Implementation, and Holly St. Clair, who is the Director of our Data Services Department and Metro Data Center. I also want to acknowledge 3 staff people, all in the Data Services Department, who did a tremendous amount of work on this particular project, a lot of it behind the scenes, but difficult and challenging work of interpretation and mapping, and who just contributed their all many, many late nights to make this as I think, fantastic a report as it is. Jamila Henderson, Susan Brunton, and Barry Fradkin. Thank you all very much. And lastly, I would note that although they are too numerous to mention or to name, we had a wonderful and active advisory committee that worked on this project from the very beginning. They met frequently. They met a little more frequently than we anticipated. They reviewed the documents at all of its stages carefully. They did so a little bit more carefully than we anticipated, but the document is, including David, as a matter of fact, and the document is much, much stronger as a result of the ways in which they challenged us, brought information to us, made us rethink concepts as we went up and down the road. This is a tough topic. It's a tough topic because, not only because it raises difficult issues in our society, but also because there are minefields in the way you interpret things, in the way you present things, and in the choices you make about what to present and what not to present. And to make a report that was going to have impact and influence, we had to stand on the shoulders of many reports that have been released prior to ours, and a lot of good work and research that's been done prior to ours. And we also had to anticipate how the report would be used by folks who want to use it really well and make good change with it, and maybe some folks who didn't, or who wouldn't. So that was really, we needed particularly our advisory committee to help us navigate that situation, and I think the results are available for all to see. So without further ado, let me go through what is still a fairly short PowerPoint, and then we're going to have some wonderful responses from some of the leaders of the community, and hopefully adequate time for some discussion among ourselves, which I hope will be the beginning of a long-term discussion about addressing these issues. We are referring to this evening's presentation. Is it up? Yes, it is. Okay. As, oh, I'm sorry. There's one other thing I was supposed to say beforehand. For those of you who may be interested in tweeting in regards to tonight's event, the hashtag for tonight's event will be Equity Metro Boston. Okay? Good. Thank you. I'm sorry. I thought I would forget about that. Keeping a straight face about that. I want everyone to think I understand what I just said. So we're, yeah. Thank you, John. So we are referring to this as all things not being equal. And the name of the report is The State of Equity in Metro Boston. And really, well, that's not working. I think we'll figure this out pretty soon. Yes, there we go. Okay, thank you. This work really has its origination in our MetroFuture regional plan. The Metropolitan Area Planning Council is the regional planning agency for 101 communities throughout Greater Boston. Basically, all of the communities inside I-495. It's a very diverse region, about 3.25 million people. We have a responsibility under our statute from time to time to develop a plan for the region and then to try and implement that plan. In December 2008, after a lengthy and very inclusive process that involved about 5,000 people and organizations, our council adopted our regional plan for the next several decades, which is called MetroFuture, Making a Greater Boston Region. And this plan has many goals and many implementation strategies to try and accomplish the vision which we laid forth through our participatory process for the Boston region looking forward to the year 2030. We want to be responsible stewards of our resources, passing on an environmentally, financially, and socially sustainable region to our children. We want to build safe, healthy, and welcoming communities. We want to involve more people in making the decisions that shape their lives. This is not only about land use, but it's about the process by which public policy and public priorities are actually set. We wanted to give people affordable and convenient options for where they live, where they work, where they go to school, and where they play. We wanted to ensure that all residents fairly share the costs and benefits of the region's growth. We know that growth is not without cost, and it's important to assess the costs and the benefits and distribute them equally, not simply to burden environmental justice populations with all the negatives of growth, but to make sure that the benefits and the burdens are fairly distributed. And lastly, we wanted to create a world-class region that is vibrant, competitive, and connected. Those are broad, some may even say mom and apple pie goals, but they are our basic 6 goals. Underneath that, we devised a series of far more detailed and specific goals, 65 in all, categorized under those 6 broad categories. Many of these goals relate to equity because throughout the plan, we focused on equity as being a critical objective of our work. We are a smart growth organization. We believe in sustainable development. We do not believe that you can create a truly sustainable region here in Metro Boston or anywhere on earth unless you pursue greater equality, and greater equity. So we tried to the greatest degree possible to bake that into our work. And so many of our goals are focused on equity. More than 4, but we picked out these 4 as examples. One of them deals with the issue of segregation. Goal number 16 deals with the issue of affordable housing. Goal number 24 deals with affordable, healthy food. Goal number 38 deals with more minority and immigrant workers having an opportunity to advance on the career ladder. And many of the other 65 goals in the MetroFuture plan have an equity component to them or are fully related to the issue of equity. Under each of those goals are a series of even more specific objectives. And each one of those objectives is tied to an indicator. And this is where we begin to get to the connection between the MetroFuture plan and the report we're providing to you tonight. To us, it's important not only to set out broad goals, not only to set out specific objectives, but to figure out how we will measure our progress in achieving that objective over time. We don't just want to talk about what would be good to do. We want to talk about what would be good to do, how to do it, and then how to measure your progress to determine if the solution you chose was a really good one or not, or whether you need to go back to the drawing board and find something else. So as an example, we have a goal here, goal number 29, that is, at least on the screen in front of me, at the very end of what I can possibly read. But I think it says that more workers will graduate from high school and go on to college or career training opportunities. Under that goal are 4 specific objectives. For example, the one that's highlighted relates to having a high school diploma or the equivalent. And then there's an indicator under that objective. Sometimes there's more than one, but in this case, there's an indicator to actually measure that over time. So we have goals that describe the MetroFuture vision in general terms. Objectives support each of the goals and are more specific and largely numeric. And indicators are tied to as many of the objectives as possible, and they are linked to specific, regularly collected data points. Now, if you think that we have 65 goals, and each one maybe has 4 objectives, some has more, some has less, and each of those has multiple indicators, well, you can see that we have hundreds of indicators in the MetroFuture plan. We can't talk about them in one report. The report would be, I think, that thick. So we decided that we were going to start releasing regular indicators reports, we call them regional indicators reports, based on specific themes within the MetroFuture plan. We chose that the first of those regional indicators reports would be on our goals that relate to equity. I think that's a significant choice. Frankly, I think it might not have been a choice that MAPC would have made 15 or 20 years ago. But we are trying to make at least a little small statement by saying we're going to look at those issues first. And this first report is a baseline report. It goes through all the indicators tied to all the objectives to figure out where we stand right now. Now, I'll digress for just a moment and say, I know many of you know this, but many of you I've had the pleasure of meeting only tonight and only from this microphone, so you don't know that. I, like Mary, I guess, I come from Boston. I and my parents have lived in the city of Boston for all of our lives. I know a little bit about this town, and I know a little bit about this region. And I understand that issues of race and issues of equality have a long and fraught history in this city and in this region. Very often we hear people talk anecdotally about where we are today compared to where we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And if you listen to folks talk about it, some people will say, oh my God, nothing has changed. Everything is just as bad as it always was. The problems are endemic. There's no way to solve them. And other people will say at exactly the same time, it's completely different. Everything has turned around. We're in the post-racial society, as Mary was referring to. The problem with both of those perspectives is that they are based upon emotions and they are based upon anecdotes. I love a good anecdote as much as the next guy. But at MAPC, we focus on data. We focus on information. We think the more interesting story is the one that may not be at either extreme, but but which is based upon actual information. And the importance about spending the time on these indicators, about assessing them, about kicking the tires with them, figuring out which ones work, which ones don't, where do we have really good data, where is there an artifact in the data that makes it really not so solid. The importance of spending time on that is that once you get to the end and produce a report like this, you have something that you can actually measure. You can say, this is what's going on with high school attainment rates and graduation rates, and we can try and come up with policies to address that issue, no matter how difficult that issue might be, and then 2 years or 5 years or 10 years from now, you can go back to the data point and figure out if you fixed it, or, being less bold than that, if you made progress. And that's why, sorry, maybe it seems like a regional indicators report, a little bit of a silly thing to get kind of emotional about, but to me, that's important because honestly, as a lifelong Bostonian, I'm kind of tired of the anecdotes. I'm kind of tired of the stories. I just want to know what works. I want to work on what works. And we'd like to think that in our small way, doing our small part, providing this baseline and committing ourselves to go do it again and again in future years is an important part of moving the region past the stories and into the real world, which we think is actually a much more interesting place to be. After we kind of kicked the tires, as I said, on all of the indicators that we were thinking about using, we came up with 50 that we thought were really good and solid. We had to get rid of some because maybe the data wasn't really solid, or it wasn't regularly connected, or we couldn't find it for the entire region. We could only find it for parts, or any one of a number of other reasons, but we came up with 50 that we thought were really good. All of these data points, all of the information about them can be found at the website www.regionalindicators, all one word, .org/equity. The report that we've produced, which is also available on our website, the executive summary and key findings, which I believe everybody has this evening that was available, that took 30 of the indicators and focused on them. Tonight, we are going to talk about 10. I have to emphasize the point that David made. 10 will not be completely satisfying. We will have left a lot out. 50 is not completely satisfying. But don't worry. We're always interested in finding other ones, figuring out if you can do it, if we can work on it. We realize that, if we do this, let's say 2 years from now again, and see where we are, whether we've made progress against the baseline, we may want to tweak some of these. We may want to add a few more. Of course, we have to measure the ones we measured in this report, but we understand times will be different in 2 years. So please read the report, go to the indicators website, give us your ideas on other things that might be included, or maybe you see one of them you think we've misinterpreted. Let us know that too. That's fine. So with that, I'm going to start going into the actual information in this report. You can't really study equity, or for that matter, sustainability or community vitality or any other issues that you look at without understanding a little bit of background on basic demographic change. And so the report actually starts out with that. There's a whole section on how is the region changing generally, and then let's take a look at equity issues in relation to that overall change. I can't go through that general chapter entirely tonight, but I'm going to basically focus on 2 items. First of all, the region is changing dramatically in terms of our demographic outlook. Pardon me here while I try to scroll up on one of my notes because there's some statistics I'm interested in giving to you. Holly is trying to come up here and help me out. I am, yes. Thank you, Holly. Yeah, okay. So one way in which the region is changing, according to our projections, and we do a huge amount of projection work in MAPC, is the white population is obviously declining. The population of color is increasing substantially. We've actually seen even more significant changes in both of these numbers between 2010 and between 2000 and 2010 than we project between 2010 and 2030. But overall, in a 30-year period, dramatic change nonetheless. very dramatic change in the percentage of people born in another country. The number under 20 years old will decline slightly, the percentage. The percentage over the age of 55 will increase tremendously. I think actually between 2000 and 2030, we're looking at about a 79% increase in the senior population, or the population over 55. So these are dramatic changes that are going on. It's important to remember they're not going on everywhere. But within the region as a whole, there is tremendous change and increasing diversity. What has also been going on, which I think is particularly appropriate to talk about this evening in light of all the coverage of the Occupy movement, is that we are seeing in this region a dramatic redistribution of wealth. What we like to do at MAPC is to take the total population and divide it into quintiles, or fifths. If you look at the bottom 4 quintiles, that's 80%. That's like everybody in this room probably, and most other people out on the street. If you look at those quintiles, you'll see that they are either staying flat in terms of inflation-adjusted income, or in some cases going down. The folks in the top fifth, that's the blue line at the very top, you'll see they've had a really good 30 years. Now, this is more than simply distressing on its own. Income is powerfully correlated with a whole other series of indicators of success in health, in educational attainment, in labor force participation, in a whole variety of things. If you have groups that suffer from inequality in a variety of ways, and they are systematically not able to increase their share of the region's wealth, then it is more and more difficult for them to overcome other difficulties. So overall issues of income distribution are incredibly important. In fact, we see that when we compare this metro region to similar metro regions throughout the country, 85% of them have a more equitable distribution of wealth. In 1979, the top quintile in Greater Boston earned 6 times as much as the lowest fifth. Today, they earn 10 times as much as the lowest fifth. It is very difficult to overcome all the other issues of equity that we'll talk about in the course of this report if we can't deal with the overall income distribution question. So now let's leave that sort of general background information and talk about some of the specific findings. This is a segregated region racially. I don't think anyone in this room needs to be told that that's the case. Historically, it's been the case. It's been the case in the city. It's been the case throughout the region. One good bit of news is that segregation has declined slightly in the course of recent years. It has particularly declined, however, in about 14 of the region's 101 communities. The decline in segregation means that we are now at about the midpoint of similar metro regions throughout the country. About half of them are more heavily segregated than we are. About half of them are less segregated than we are. So it's a little better than it is in terms of income equality, but it's pretty cold comfort because we have a long way to go. One of the troubling statistics that's indicated by the 2 maps that are in front of you, one of which is largely blue and one of which is largely red, is that young people in our region are even more heavily segregated than adults. Despite improvements in segregation overall, despite the fact that 14 of the cities and towns in the Metro Boston region are significantly more diverse than they were several years ago, it is still virtually impossible for a white child to grow up in a community with a significant number of children of color, and it is virtually impossible for a child of color in our region to grow up in a region with a significant number of white children. Interestingly, those 2 things do not have to be true together. One could be true and the other one could not. But in this region, they are both true. And considering the fact that those children are our future, not only in the sense that we commonly say children are our future, but in the sense that particularly children of color, those are going to be the people who are a greater and greater percentage of the population, as we saw on the slide earlier. If they are living in more and more segregated areas, then that is a problem that we must confront. Now, partly as a result of that segregation, but not entirely as a result of that segregation, we see that public primary school students in Massachusetts, and we could not do this for the region, so we thought it was so important that we still provided the information for Massachusetts overall. We see that there is a tremendous difference racially in terms of whether or not children tend to attend high poverty schools. We define high poverty schools as those where over half the students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch, and very high poverty schools as those where 3/4 of the children are so eligible. An even larger number of particularly Latino and Black or African American children attend high poverty schools than you would expect based on patterns of residential segregation. And all children in high poverty schools have a tendency to perform less well by virtue of the fact that they attend those schools than would be the case if you simply looked at an indicator of income, for example. So even a child from a relatively higher income family who attends a high poverty school has worse outcomes than would be the case for a similar child of similar income living in an area where they attended a lower poverty school. This is a link between the pattern of residential segregation and the pattern of attendance in school and long-term educational attainment, which we need to pay particularly close attention to. Now, we mentioned earlier, I think Mary mentioned earlier, you may have seen this in Yvonne Abraham's column in the Globe on Sunday, one of the issues we looked at was low birth weight. Low birth weight is a very important issue that to us relates to the issue of attainment educationally, because those children, when they're born with low birth weight, have a whole panoply of problems that they need to deal with, which cannot help but have an influence over their educational attainment, whatever the school that they may attend. Low birth weight among children is correlated with race, and it's correlated with educational attainment. But still, as Mary indicated, an African-American woman with a college degree in the greater Boston region is more likely, significantly more likely, to have a low birth weight child than a white woman whose highest graduation rate is high school. And I think that actually shows up in the two arrows that are now before you on the screen. That indicates that all of those children are going to be starting just a few steps, a significant number of steps behind the 8 ball. And that issue, that handicap, if you will, is related to race as well as related to issues of educational attainment. So it's not good enough to say that we will enact public policy objectives which overall will deal with the issue of low birth weight. We have to recognize that embedded within the statistics about low birth weight are elements of inequity that we must confront. Another health indicator that we looked at is youth asthma hospitalization, and we found that this varied tremendously on a geographic basis. We all know generally, we've heard, that young people have more asthma. But those rates of asthma are far higher in low-income communities, far higher in communities of color, and one of the ways we measure this is about the frequency of youth asthma hospitalizations. In fact, it's linked to the previous point because suffering from asthma is more likely if you are born low birth weight. I might note, if I just, before I leave the previous slide, if you look at the report overall, you'll see a very high number of indicators that are related to public health. Many people think of MAPC as being a land use agency, and it's true that most of our work historically has been on land use issues, the environment, housing, economic development, transportation, et cetera. We were really pressed by the participants in the MetroFuture process to do more work in other areas, public health, public education, public safety. And we were reluctant initially, but I think it was good that we decided to go in that regard. You can't tell the equity story in Greater Boston if you don't look at indicators of health. There are so many issues, the two that we mentioned on birth weight, asthma rates, hypertension, morbidity, mortality at a low age, all of these indicators that are related to health. If you leave that out, you miss a huge part of the picture. So it may be a surprise to some people, but we're very proud of it. In fact, we're very proud of the fact that Mariana is actually heading up a new public health division at MAPC, which sort of emphasizes our attention to this issue. So, of course, there are links between all of these issues. If you look at low birth weight, and you look at asthma, and you say, well, those kids, of course, when they're in school are going to have more difficulty with educational attainment. It's not just issues of income. It's not just the educational attainment of your parents. It's also some of the health issues. And those lead, all of those factors together, lead to one of the things that we emphasize here, even though everybody knows generally that this is a real serious problem, and that is that dropout rates, although we are doing a little better in Greater Boston than in the rest of Massachusetts, the rates of high school dropout are still dramatically different based on race. You can see before you the comparison between whites and Asians and African Americans and particularly Latinos. These are long-term, persistent difficulties of educational attainment. And they relate to the ability of people to gain adequate income in the future. Here is a slide that indicates what we call labor force participation, which is basically a fancy way of saying how likely are you to get and keep a job based on educational attainment. And it dramatically varies based on level of educational attainment. So all of these things flow one to the other. One of the reasons that we organized our report by life stages is to show how these things build up over time. And although individuals can always, if they're, by dint of circumstance or talent or capability, can break out of the mold, nonetheless, at any point in their lives, it's still important to understand that the effects of inequity are cumulative over time. Educational attainment, linked to whether you can gain and keep a job, is obviously related to income. And whether you participate in the labor force obviously has a tremendous impact on how much income you earn in the course of your lifetime. And here we see continuing disturbing disparities. Now, there's one thing about this that I want to point out. The Asian population appears to be the highest earning income group in the Greater Boston region. And although this is true taken overall, there is a bifurcation or a division within the Asian community wherein a substantial portion of the Asian community actually has extremely low incomes. That is a little bit masked by this particular chart. It's discussed and described in the report, but I didn't want anyone to go away with sort of the wrong impression of that by looking at this particular bit of information. Now, we all know that the single biggest thing you purchase during your life, whether you buy or rent, is housing. And there are a lot of particular indicators that we focus on in the course of our work that relate to housing. The particular one that I wanted to show to you today was the affordability of housing occupied by households at different income levels for Metro Boston cities and towns with a population of more than 20,000. For particular reasons of the data, we couldn't go to the smaller communities, but we went to the vast majority of communities. Now, the chart is fascinating, but a little bit difficult to interpret with a quick glance, so I'm going to just sort of ask you to listen to my words as I say a little bit about what it says. Too little housing in the region is available for our lowest income households, and very often what is available is much too difficult for them to afford. This chart shows that about 160,000 households in our region earning less than 50% of the area median income, which is about $46,000 a year, now occupy housing they cannot actually afford, which means they're paying over 30% of their income for rent. Far more of these households live in housing they can't afford than live in housing that they can afford. And in 2009, 25% of all renters in the region paid 50% or more of their income for rent. These are startling statistics. Think about these statistics, or say these statistics the next time someone tells you that because of the downturn in the economy and all the for-sale housing that's available, that the housing crisis is over. The housing crisis is not over. Rents are actually going up. All the people who have sadly been foreclosed upon are looking for places to rent, and we're building hardly anything at this point in time. Well, I'm a housing planner, so I could go on and on about that for a very, very long time. We spend a lot of time in the report at the life stage of seniors, because in fact they are the fastest growing population in our region. And there are a series of fascinating statistics about the inequities that seniors face. One, and the only one that we're bringing up to you today, is about a new group of people. I know that some of you know about this already, but many people don't. An increasing number of people in the population are grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. They are the primary breadwinners for their grandchildren. This is particularly true in communities of color, but it is not exclusively true in communities of color. As many MAPC council members who are here now know, one of our vice presidents who lived in the town of Bedford raised his grandchildren. To be perfectly honest, he was raising his grandchildren until the last day of his life. It is an increasingly common demographic. And these families are far more likely to live in poverty than everyone else who is raising their children. And since this is a growing demographic group, again, from a policy perspective, it's something we have to pay some attention to. 10 indicators only. I hope that gives you a taste of the issues we try to cover and the seriousness of what we're dealing with here. So what are the steps moving forward? At MAPC and in MetroFuture, we not only focus on information and problems, we are committed to focusing on solutions. In 2012, Jesse and Mariana and the other members of the staff will be working on the second phase of this report, which is policy recommendations to confront some of these serious issues. Folks, in this session, we need to even more stand on the shoulders of other people, because we won't magically come up with all the solutions to problems that have been around in this country for hundreds of years and in the world a lot longer than that. But we are determined to make steps forward. That's what we do at MAPC. We just don't think, we also do. We don't just write, we also advocate. And so we are asking all of you to try and join the process of helping us in 2012 come up with specific policy recommendations, specific budget recommendations, things that can be done not only by government, but by employers and institutions, maybe even things that can be done by individual households to try and move the needle on these issues so that when we measure them again, we will have seen progress. We have a series of wonderful respondents and all of you who are going to now join us in a conversation. I am going to thank you and turn the podium back over to David. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mark. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to ask the panelists if they would join me up here. Clearly, Mark, you have a very, it is a sobering account, and I do want to say that one of the most impressive things is Mark's entry into the 21st century. I mean, I think his, I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have told you all how to treat appropriately, so I appreciate that. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists, who are going to have about 5 minutes each to discuss and respond to the report. I'm going to introduce them all at once and then have them give their comments in the order by which I introduced them. Amy Chung is a first-year doctoral student at Harvard Graduate School of Education with a focus on cultural identity, building among Asian teens. Prior to starting her doctorate, she worked at the Asian Community Development Corporation for 4 years. Amy. Ron Marlowe is the Assistant Secretary for Access and Opportunity for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Over the years, he's had several positions in various levels of government and community development, and is very active throughout the community in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Dwayne Marsh is a senior advisor at the Office of Sustainable Housing and Communities for the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Although quite accomplished a broad range of nonprofit and foundation work, he is known to us locally for the work he did at Policy Link and helping to get Action for Regional Equity started here. Paulo Pinta is the executive director of the Massachusetts Alliance of Portuguese Speakers, who has 20 years of experience in health and social service arenas, as well as extensive community organizing experience. Sarang Sakavat is the Federal Policy Director for the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, before which he was an immigrant advocate in the city of New York, immigrant rights advocate. Richard Walker is Senior Vice President for Regional Outreach at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. He has been active and involved in a broad range of business, banking, community development, and community relations activities for even longer. Richard also served as a member of the advisory committee for this report. I'd like to welcome you all and begin with you, Amy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank MAPC for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and also thank MAPC for putting out what I think is an extremely interesting, timely, important report. As a first-year doctoral student, I am steeped in research all the time, and it's something that it's a culture that I'm being assimilated into. And I have to say that the fact that this Indicators project is so nuanced is something refreshing for me, because often in the educational research that I read, the indicators that are being used are maybe one or two indicators. And I think that this report gives a very rich description of what's happening in the state of equity, or inequity rather. Some of the things I'd like to point out that were particularly salient for me, first off, I'd like to say that when I was invited to speak, to give a perspective from the Asian American community, I was worried, and it's a very difficult task, not only because this demographic, or this category rather, is comprised of so many different ethnic groups, languages, backgrounds, histories, but also because I do want to be clear that my experience at the Asian Community Development Corporation prior was very much centered on the Chinese community. So in respect to the diversity of the Asian American category, I also want to say that I speak from the experience of being from the Chinese community, or Chinese American community. That said, I think it might be interesting for people to know or to learn that one of the ongoing tensions, I think, for folks from the Asian American community is identifying ethnically versus identifying as one consolidated political entity. And that's a conversation we have, within the field ourselves. I think that Mark pointed out that bifurcation of incomes, and I really do thank MAPC for noting that, because often what happens, I think, for the Asian American community is that there's this indicator that we have this high median income, and a lot of this is assumed with that. I'd like to mention that not only is that bifurcation in income sort of between ethnic groups, so that you do see, for example, a bifurcation between East Asian groups and Southeast Asian groups. You also see it within ethnicities, so that the Chinese working poor in Chinatown, for example, have a very different experience than the more professional classes of Chinese living out in Metro West. Why this might be important is because just within the Chinese community, we are serving a group that is comprised of many different, again, backgrounds, different languages, and also the regional spread of groups is very distinctive, so that for service providers, the population you're working with in the Metro West might come from one region in China versus those who are working with Chinese in Quincy or Malden. And sort of anecdotally speaking, when I meet someone who is Chinese and I ask, where in China they are from or their parents might be from, you can assume a lot based on province. And this is complex for those who are serving that population, but also just sort of add some nuance to understanding the Chinese community. Secondly, I think in terms of responding just to a demographic point about the aging population, in terms of the elderly among, I think, Asian American populations, the challenge is that many of them are dealing with both physical isolation, perhaps living in areas that are not well served by public transportation, as well as linguistic and social isolation. So that the problem is that that, first of all, that the elderly that are arriving in the United States from abroad, for example, due to different kinds of immigration policies, some of them are arriving on their own before their children. Others are living with their children, but because of changing family patterns, their children might not actually be able to provide for them or take them to the doctor, help assist them in getting around. And what happens is we have these groups of the elderly who are very much isolated. And most of the services at this point are concentrated in places like Chinatown or Quincy. And it's very difficult for those who are living in far-flung suburbs to get the kinds of services they need. And the final point is just because my own interest is in youth development, I think that for the Asian American community, in some ways, seeing that the high school dropout rate is rather low is optimistic. On the other hand, I'd like to draw attention to the idea of college persistence, so that while many are graduating or not dropping out of high school, this notion of whether students can be successful in college is a whole different matter. But I think it deserves attention because often, I think not just for Asian American groups, but for students of color, what students might be learning in schools, not just in terms of content, but in terms of what behavior is expected of them, or what, or how they interact with adults, or even learning about, for example, history from their own cultures. Or their self-directedness, these kinds of things aren't necessarily represented in high school curriculum, but it's the kind of things that make a student successful in college. So I'd like to, one indicator I'd like to add is perhaps college persistence as well. One teacher that I work with often talks about the codes of power that students do need to be explicitly taught. And I think for all students of color, that might be something important to attend to.
If you don't mind, I'll actually take the liberty of standing because, as Mark said, the information is sobering, and to get up and talk about my reactions to the report, I think it's better if I stand. Let me give an initial caveat that I am both a policymaker and a bureaucrat. And you may think about that, but let me explain what I mean. The policymaker in me sees the report and wants to rush to action. The bureaucrat, I think you can imagine, would like to do and just see the report and maybe pontificate on it and then file it away as so many reports get filed away. And so I'm going to stay in policymaker mode because I think that's where I can offer the best responses. Before I formally begin, let me say good evening. Good evening. See, you don't know call and response. The first part of engagement is call and response. So I'm going to do that one more time. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. You don't know what that does to a speaker. I will try to stay with See, we are engaging. I will try to stay within the 5 minutes, but let me say this first and up front, that I have two thank yous to offer. One, let me say thank you to each and every one of you for coming out tonight, because in the words of one of my favorite artists, music artists, who won't be named, you could have chose to be anywhere tonight, but you chose to be here. Some of you may know who that is. I'll leave it at that. Secondly, let me say thank you to someone who I know is not here, Ms. Fran Fajana, formerly of the Mass Law Reform Institute, because Fran was very instrumental in getting MLRI and MLAC to support a report called Areas of Opportunity, a report produced in 2009 that I would like to think is a precursor to this report because it starts to set a framework for how geography greatly impacts life opportunities. Tonight, I will focus on what I will call really C cubed. And what is C cubed? C cubed speaks to really, 1, a congratulations, 2, a commitment, and 3, a challenge. First, let me congratulate MAPC and the advisory committee that helped guide the work, because for whatever critiques may come forward about the report and what's missing, it was a massive undertaking. One can tell by the 123 pages, if you get the full report and all the compilation of data, that this was a massive undertaking, one that was greatly needed and can set a platform for future action. And so again, whatever you may think about the contents or what work remains to be done, congratulations, Mark, the staff of MAPC, and those who served on the advisory committee. Commit. The things you must do following are you must commit to understand not just the problems that are articulated in the report, but the root causes of those problems. The report does go into talking about how some historical factors have played a critical role to where we are today. Some of them, unfortunately, governmental policy. But only when you take an understanding of the root causes in addition to understanding what the problems are, can you then formulate identifiable policy recommendations and programmatic approaches to advance the ball forward. So number 2 is identify not just policy and programmatic prescriptions that respond to the problems, but identify those that respond to the root causes of the problems. Third, take the report as you move it forward and quickly and quantifiably identify which government agencies should be responsible for working with you in advancing those policy and programmatic solutions. We've already seen evidence of that in Sunday's Boston Globe by Yvonne Abraham, where the Department of Public Health is taking the information that I'd like to believe that the MAPC report brought to stark and glaring to their attention, and they are now talking about using that data to advance an agenda to address the problems of low birth weight. In each of the recommendation areas, there is a government agency, particularly at the state where I work, that has responsibility for being responsive to those needs, especially if we're talking about it in an equity context. Beyond identifying the government agencies and government agents, identify your non-governmental partners who are based in the community and are working on pieces of the problem, whether they're community development corporations, community health centers, community action agencies, or any other number of community-based organizations who are doing their piece to join in league with you. Last but not least, challenge. Tonight is just a start. The engagement of call and response should be reflective of the need to organize, to mobilize, to affect change. This report will mean nothing if you are not constantly engaged and involved in the processes that will come after it. Mark mentioned the policy formulation work, the programmatic formation work that will take place. It is up to each and every one of you to be involved in that effort, or you can rest assured we can gather again in 10 years and we'll have the same conversation. I will leave you with a single thought. It's one that if you ever have the misfortune of receiving an email from me, you will see at the bottom. It's one that I adopted when I took on the role of the Assistant Secretary of Access and Opportunity, which, by the way, is a euphemism for civil rights or a euphemism for equity. The quote is really simple, and I use it to motivate the work I do, and hopefully, if you join in league, you will help bring it to bear. Equity of opportunity is not the enemy of efficiency. We talk about efficiency a lot in government. It is the promise of democratic governance. And if that promise is to be made real, we need your help to make it real. I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone. I will not dive into my 5 minutes with all the accolades I could give here, but I will time myself so I'm on time. I want to first say to Mark, thanks for broadening the discussion, because this is more than a little statement for a regional planning entity to step out and make these kinds of assertions about why the region is the way it is and how it needs to improve is really important. Everybody has said sobering. I don't think you can avoid saying that as one of the responses. I think it's challenging, it's inspiring, but it's also essential that we use this information effectively. The data is intense. I'm going to stay a little systematic because of my 4 minutes and 40 seconds left. What we're talking about, these are generational patterns we're getting at. We have to think about generational solutions. My mom often said when you're speaking in public, you can only say one thing well in 5 minutes. I'm going to try to say 3. The first one is that federal policy plays a role. Now, Ron, you mentioned being a policy advocate and a bureaucrat. I'm training to be a polycrat. We're trying to figure out how to do the advocacy piece and do the bureaucratic piece at the same time. And I was drawn to a lot of things in the report, but on page 6 of the full report, we were told to read the entire thing. I noticed some language here. It said, the segregated residential pattern we see today reflects historic and political, economic, and interpersonal discrimination, not just personal preference. Since the 19th century, federal and local government actions have created segregation through racial zoning. It goes on to say that federal policy has been a major player in this, and this has been acknowledged for 40 years. We're not going to change these things overnight. We're not going to change them unless each level of government takes its responsibility and thinks about how we unravel this. Now, in this political context we're in right now, this takes a deft touch, and we can't just be heavy-handed about that. The grant program I work with at HUD is around sustainable regional planning, and our grant program is a start in that direction, how we think about changing the practice of planning nationally, not just simple grants into regions. 153 regions now are participating, $250 million invested, 150 million people live in these communities. This is a national program now in just 2 years. And I think that we can learn from this tool and this example, asking others who are participating about how we improve that practice. You have a robust partnership amongst the federal agencies here in what we call Region 1, which is basically New England. And I think they are very excited about this and other grants in the area. And they're a tool you can leverage to think about how you get federal policy changes to happen quickly to address some of these issues. The second thing I'd notice is the alignment of these issues, planning and the effort at MetroFuture and the planning grant that MAPC is advancing. It's more than just timely. It's striking how many of the issues are regional in nature or interconnected across communities, even though it is 101 kingdoms, towns and jurisdictions that are here. We know that 18 of these outcomes are very directly about equity. I think you said 30 are related heavily. All 65 touch on these. There's a recognition as equity as a driver for efficient regional planning. We also can't underestimate the value of MAPC breaking into this conversation and bearing this message. There's some people in this room, and I could have you raise your hands, who have been working on this 5, 10, 15, 25 years. And having a new kind of entity say this is an essential message strengthens the resolve and the argument and the case making we need to make into other places where it hasn't quite taken root yet that this is important. Now, at the highest level, the MetroFuture plan had 6 visions. I think you could argue that none of these visions, I won't read them to you, but they're quite compelling, and I'm definitely going to take these back, can be achieved without advancing equity. That is the centerpiece of the goal that you have here. The last thing I'd mention is about governance and leadership. These aren't simple problems. These are huge systemic influences we have to address, and it's going to take constituency, and I think somewhat unusual constituency to make solutions on some of these issues. Particularly effective communities are going to have to be not just witnesses to this information or engaged in talking about it, they're going to have to be taking leadership roles in how we change it. And I want to applaud MAPC and its own governance structure around the project that's advancing for this through MetroFuture and taking that challenge head on. MetroFuture has a potential to really influence some of these things. Putting that equity conversation into the regional infrastructure, again, in different places than we see before, but it has to be leveraged with buy-in commitment and I think some new metrics around that question of leadership and governance as well. So I know you guys spent about 7 years and 10 million hours building the MetroFuture plan, but just in the kind of silent back page, maybe the strategy number 14 to add to the 13 brilliant strategies you have already would be to infuse equity into all aspects of MetroFuture, because you're trying to do that anyway. But calling that out again as the Metropolitan Planning Agency brings a new conversation to the table. And then, of course, we'd have to make 3 or 4 indicators you could track on that, and that would be the fun work, which we would gladly work with you on, actually. But I think we have to think about what are the things that will trend well to equity outcomes over time, that at the same time you're measuring the impact of the education and the life birth weights all the way through to, to housing. Governance is essential to making this happen. And how do we change that governance structure is going to be important. My last thought, as I hear my little alarm about to go off, is that you guys are clearly playing a national leadership role in this, but don't become complacent or presumptuous in that leadership. There will always be something new you can learn from each other and your peers, and that's what makes this whole process exciting. So I applaud the work and look forward to the conversation.
I was looking for Ava. Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Boa noite. My name is Paulo Pinto. I'm the Executive Director of MAPS, Mass Alliance for Portuguese Speakers, and I wanted to say thank you so much to MAPC for this amazing report with lots of wonderful, really important findings. Thank you to Jesse and to Mariana for their amazing study of our region. And so my first impression was that as a Portuguese speaker, I really didn't see a lot here about Portuguese speakers in the region. Obviously, I know that there is a huge lack of data. So I don't blame you, Jesse and Mariana, for not having this information here. Obviously, I blame the Census Bureau and other government agencies. And so I would like to challenge all of us to really work at making the Census Bureau much more accountable to its population so that it can count its residents more effectively. And as the executive director of MAPS last year, we worked very hard with members of the community to educate our population to get counted in the census, but to get counted a little bit more effectively. So we told people to check off other. Who wants to be another? No one. So I checked off other, and we told many of our members of our community to check off other and to then write in Cape Verdean, Brazilian, Portuguese, and so on. So now comes the challenge for us is to get that information released, and the Census Bureau has not. We've been told today that it's going to cost anywhere between $3,000 to $5,000 per group, per ethnic group, to get that information released. I'm hoping that maybe MAPC and others can help us get that information released. We'd love to be able to do that so that we have a better understanding of our large ethnic population. Because as you know, there is, and I love what Mark said about moving beyond the anecdotes. I would love to move beyond the anecdotes, but that's all I have. So, you know, as we struggle to, as we, you know, write proposals to get more funding to serve our populations, so that our populations have better access to health and education and services of many kinds. We really, you know, struggle with being able to have actual data, real data. So I would love to have you help me to get to that data so that Jassy and Mariana, next time they do this study, they can have lots of information about Portuguese speakers in Massachusetts. And then I would like my other observation is around the foreign-born. You know, there was a lot of information around you know, minority populations and ethnic minority populations, I should say. But the foreign-born is reflected in the study that was presented tonight is a growing group. And I would love to be able to compare, to see more comparison between the native-born and the foreign-born, to really see how well are we integrating our immigrant populations into our communities, because I think that would be really interesting. And the other point is that we also I also noticed that this study really shows that the elderly population, the senior population, is really a growing group, and that we need to pay attention to. And I would love to see more information about this. The inequities of this group. So that's basically all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Hi. They put me and Paulo right after each other. He's one of our board members, by the way. So I'm also going to talk about immigrant issues. One of the things, I mean, let me start by saying, actually, that this report is absolutely fantastic. I'm sure it's something I could read many times and just find some new nugget of information in it that I think is just fascinating. But coming from an immigrant advocate's perspective, I think one thing that you just simply can't quantify and you can't really put in a report like this is how welcome immigrants feel in the communities that they reside in. It's been one of the big challenges that I think in Massachusetts certainly, but nationally as well. You look at places like, well, right now Arizona, Alabama, the type of attitudes that people take towards immigrants and the way it makes immigrants feel unwelcome. It pushes them much more into the shadows. Education, I think, is been one of the biggest issues in Alabama. You've seen children being taken out of school. They're afraid to go to school now. And unfortunately, we have seen, it's much more localized here in Massachusetts, but we've seen those type of situations happen as well. People might be familiar with what happened in Milford in August when an undocumented drunk driver hit and killed someone on a motorcycle. The community there has, well, let's just say they have not been welcoming. The harassment on the street has been really pretty horrendous. We keep hearing stories about it, and people, you know, we try and get these stories out there, and people say, well, they just say we don't believe you when we tell them these stories. We have parents who are afraid to take their children to the park, afraid to take their children to school, just because they're afraid to go outside the door. And unfortunately, again, you know, these are things that you can't quantify, but these are definitely has a very major impact on how well the immigrant community is able to become equal with the non-immigrant community. I think another issue we see, and you know, one of the things we constantly fighting on the state level is access to benefits. And when you keep talking about, well, immigrants shouldn't have access to this benefit, immigrants shouldn't have access to that benefit, you create almost a sense of guilt among those immigrant populations where they feel like, I shouldn't be going after this. I'm a bad person for trying to get food stamps. I'm a bad person for trying to get housing. And again, these are the kind of things that really hold people back from becoming equal within the society. And one thing I'm very curious to see as we go forward is what the settlement patterns are for immigrants as they come into the state, into the metropolitan area. Because one thing we constantly see around the country is as new settlement areas, as immigrants move into new settlement areas, like for instance, Alabama, Georgia, that's when you tend to see the most resistance to the immigrant populations, where you tend to see the most hostility. So I'm curious to see over the next 20 years as MAPC works through this, where we see more immigrants settling and how equal they're able to be in those specific towns that they're settling in. I think this is a great start, though. I'm very interested to see how, where this road leads us and how all of us can really come together to make sure that it leads us to good places. So thanks a lot.
Well, one of the things about going last is all the smart people get to speak before you do, and you're supposed to say something witty or smart at the end of this conversation. Plus that, the time is going by. So I had the opportunity to preview this report with the Smart Growth Alliance back in the spring. And by the way, I had 15 minutes to speak Denmark and not, not 5. And during the course of that presentation, one of the things that I said, simply put, race matters. As many of you know, that's the title of a best-selling book by Dr. Cornel West. Race is a major factor that determines where and how we live. Race continues to be a determinant, compounding disadvantage, separating us into ghettos, and sentencing generations to remain in poverty. And I think that the presentation that Mark gave us some indication about some of those things and that impact on our region as a result of it. I very much welcome Mary Skelton Roberts relating her experience to you as a black woman growing up here in Boston. I was born in Boston, but I was raised in Dover, Delaware, where I was one of 5 kids that integrated to junior high school and felt the same kinds of disrespect, discrimination. I can remember, well, I won't go back that far. I'll stop there. But to say that the same kinds of things occurred. I want to reflect a little bit about what's next. I work for an institution that is heavily steeped in the search for analysis of the holy grail of data. I mean, we just manufacture it in all kinds of ways in a very positive effort to try to help keep our economy going. But one of the things that I've learned from working with economists for over 20 years is that the data is only part of the story. It helps get us started, but it's the dialogue that results from what the data says and the gaps that are indicated in what the data doesn't say that really, I think, forms the discussion that really needs to happen going forward. So this is just the start, and it is not the end all, and the next reporting cycle will not be the end all. It's the dialogue that occurs as a result of the information that we get. So the two things that I want to leave you with in terms of where we go from here is the need for a vision to be able to utilize what it is that the data and the dialogue tells us, and the leadership that is necessary to take that vision forward in a way that hopefully the community, this region, can utilize it to move us all forward. And with